In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And warp transit, which is somehow worse, because at least in war you can see what's trying to kill you. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from inside a storm. 19 days inside the warp aboard a battleship called the Unyielding Contrition, 9 kilometers of iron, 47,000 souls, and a Geller field that started failing on day 5. Told by a man named Dak Thurren, armsman 2nd grade, whose entire job was standing at checkpoints and keeping corridors safe. Simple work, until the corridor stopped being empty. This is a story about what happens when the walls start talking and the lights go out and the people around you begin seeing things that aren't finished yet. About a ship so old it had a voice of its own, and what that voice chose to do when everything else was falling apart. And about a man who counts things, because counting is the only honest thing left when the universe stops making sense. It's 19 days long. It feels longer. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. You want to know what it was like? Fine, I'll tell you. But I need you to understand something before I start. Not everything I'm about to say is going to sound real. Some of it isn't going to fit inside the kind of orderly thinking that keeps men sane. That's all right. I spent 19 days inside the warp during the Vethkar storm, and sanity was the first casualty. The second was sleep. The third was everyone I'd ever called a friend. So if you're sitting comfortably with your recaf and your notes and your little brass-fitted data slate, I'd say good for you. Enjoy it. Because when I'm done talking, you're going to know something you can't unknow. And knowing it doesn't make anything better. I've tried. My name is Dak Thurren, armsman, 2nd grade, stationed aboard the battleship Unyielding Contrition. Battle Fleet Obscurus, Vethkar sector assignment, operating out of Dunhold Station. I spent 14 years on that ship before the storm. 14 years of patrol routes, prisoner escorts, cleaning up after drunk ratings in the bilge decks, and standing watch over corridors so long you could walk them for 20 minutes and still be in the same section. The Contrition was 9 kilometers from bow to stern. 9 kilometers of iron and adamantium and faith hammered together over 4 centuries. The rated crew, the military complement, the people logged in the active service rosters as armed, trained, and responsible for keeping the ship alive and lethal, numbered around 47,000. That number doesn't count the void-born menials in the lower maintenance subdecks, the servitors, the hereditary serf families that had lived in the ship's bowels since her commissioning and whose names were tracked in liturgical household records the Mechanicus kept, but the Navy didn't. You add all of them, and the number gets very large. 4 full companies of naval armsmen were among that rated number. The men like me, the checkpoint holders, the corridor walkers, the ones whose job it was to keep the rest of the 47,000 from killing each other, or worse. Add whatever guard regiments happened to be riding with us at the time, and it gets larger still. The Contrition was a city. She was a world. Some of the people born on that ship lived their whole lives and died without ever seeing her outer hull. They were born in the maintenance subdecks. They worked in the maintenance subdecks. They were burned in the ship's crematoriums, and their ash was fed back into the recycler tanks that kept the others fed. That's not a metaphor. That was policy. Armsmen policy required us to enforce it, occasionally. I'm from Varanthos, Hive World, Segmentum Obscurus, 8 weeks' travel from the Obscurus fleet yards, even on a fast courier. Most people haven't heard of it. That's fine. Most people who've heard of it wish they hadn't. I grew up in the middle tiers of Hive Vrast, third largest on the continent, which is a way of saying I grew up somewhere dark and loud, and full of people who'd strip your boots off your feet if you slept too soundly. I enlisted at 17 because a Navy conscription officer offered me 3 meals a day, and I was young enough to think that was enough. By the time I figured out what I'd actually agreed to, I was already trained, tattooed with the aquila on my left forearm, and assigned to my first posting. I adapted. You adapt or you fail, and failure in the Imperial Navy aboard a ship of war has a very specific vocabulary. It's usually short words. It usually ends with the word airlock. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand who I was before I tell you who I became. I wasn't idealistic. I wasn't brave in any noble sense of the word. I did my job because doing my job kept me alive, and staying alive was the one ambition I'd never lost. I'd seen enough of Varanthos and enough of the wider galaxy to know that the universe wasn't built for the comfort of men like me. But I knew how to stand a watch. I knew how to clear a corridor, hold a checkpoint, manage a crowd of panicking ratings without someone getting shot who didn't need to be. I was good at my job. That matters. When everything starts coming apart, being good at your job is the only thing standing between you and the thing that wants to eat your soul. Let me tell you what good at my job actually meant on the Contrition, because I think people hear armsmen and imagine something more heroic than the reality. An armsman on a battleship spends maybe 5% of his service in anything resembling a crisis. The other 95% is this: you walk corridors. You walk them again. You manage the human machinery of a city-sized vessel that has been compressed into a metal tube and subjected to the stresses of deep void travel, which means you manage hunger and overcrowding and resentment and boredom, and the particular social pathologies that develop in populations that can never leave. You break up fights before they become murders. You escort rated personnel through sections they aren't cleared to transit alone. You stand post at security checkpoints for 6 hours at a stretch with nothing to look at except the same 50-meter stretch of corridor, lit by the same overhead panels, walked by the same faces on the same rotations. You learn to read people by their gait and their posture and the set of their shoulders, because in a population of 47,000, there are always going to be the ones who are about to do something that requires your attention. You learn what a man looks like 2 hours before he snaps, what a crowd looks like 2 minutes before it turns. You learn the ship's rhythms the way a fisherman learns a tidal estuary, not from study, but from years of being inside it. I knew the Contrition that well by year 4. By year 14, I knew her the way I knew my own hands. That intimacy was worth everything when the storm came. It was also, occasionally, worse than knowing nothing at all, because you cannot unsee what is wrong with a thing you know that precisely. The Unyielding Contrition. Let me tell you about her properly, because she matters to this story in ways I didn't understand until near the end. She was an Emperor-class battleship, one of the oldest still in active service along the Obscurus frontier, built in the shipyards of Tethrak Station over the course of 60 years, commissioned some 400 years before I ever set foot aboard her. 4 centuries. Think about what that means for a moment. The ship had been at war continuously for 4 centuries. She'd seen campaigns I'd only read about in briefing abstracts. She'd been to the Eye of Terror. She'd been to the Maelstrom. She'd been repaired so many times in so many different yards that her internal layout was a patchwork nightmare of different architectural traditions and engineering schools. Corridors that terminated in walls where there used to be doors, entire deck sections sealed off from the rest because nobody alive remembered what was in them or why they'd been sealed. Her machine spirit, the consciousness that lived in her systems, older than most planetary dynasties, had been active so long that she developed what the Mechanicus priests called eccentricities. What the rest of us called them was less charitable. She groaned. That's the first thing you notice about an old ship. Not the smell, not the heat, not the noise of tens of thousands of people living and dying in enclosed metal spaces. You get used to all of that in the first year. The thing you never stop noticing is the sound the hull makes, like a living thing settling in its sleep. Deep, resonant impacts traveling through the superstructure that you feel in your chest before you hear them with your ears. When the ship was under acceleration, it was almost rhythmic. When she was at rest in the void, it was something else. It was the sound of metal under stress, the sound of old wounds not quite healed. I used to lie in my bunk and listen to it, and it felt like being swallowed by something that had forgotten you were there. My bunk was in armsmen's quarters on Deck 19, Section Vermilion 4, which was technically part of what they called the inner hull zone, meaning we were in the layered sections between the outer armor and the inhabited core, close enough to the hull that sometimes you could hear the void on the other side of 3 meters of adamantium if the ship went quiet enough and you pressed your ear to the cold metal. I did that once on a dare from Bast Kun, old Bast who'd been an armsman for 30 years and had the 1,000-yard stare that either meant wisdom or brain damage, and usually it was both. What I heard was nothing, but the nothing had weight to it. The nothing had pressure. That's the void. That's what nothing actually sounds like when you're close enough to it, and the only thing between you and it is a wall you can touch with your hands. Bast Kun. I'll come back to him. Everyone in this story I'll come back to eventually. That's the nature of what happened on the Contrition. Everyone was connected to everything, threads running through the whole nightmare, and I only understood the pattern much later when I had enough distance and silence to think it through. Bast was the senior armsman in my section. Not a sergeant, not formally. That was Mira Kachlen, who I'll also tell you about. But Bast was the one you went to when you needed to know how things actually worked. 30 years of service meant he'd been on 6 different ships, survived 3 warp transits that had gone wrong in ways that never made it into official fleet records, and had the kind of superstitions and rituals that most men would call madness, but which, after you'd known him a while, started to seem less mad and more like the kind of practical theology that kept people breathing when everything else stopped working. He hung small iron fetishes from his bunk frame. He drew ward marks in cleaning solvent on the deck plates before sleep. He kept a tallow candle, actual tallow from actual rendered fat, not synthetic, and he lit it during warp transit. 1 flame for the Emperor, 2 for the Astronomicon, 3 for the ship's spirit. He'd been doing it for 20 years. When the storm hit and the candles went out one by one, I understood why he'd kept them. Sergeant Mira Kachlen was our section commander. 41 years old, from a naval family. Her father had been a lieutenant on a frigate that got swallowed by an rock somewhere near Sheridan, and her mother had been a void-born rating who died when a coolant line ruptured on Deck 32 of some ship I can't remember the name of. Mira had been born in space, lived in space, and was going to die in space, and she knew it, and had made her peace with it in a way that made her very calm and very dangerous. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She had a way of looking at you, level, flat, entirely without judgment, that made you feel like she'd already accounted for every variable in the situation and had reached a conclusion, and your only job was to catch up. She was the best officer I ever served under. She was fair, which is rarer in the Navy than you'd think, and she was competent, which is rarer still. She held her section together through the first 4 days of the storm by sheer force of will and clear orders, and the kind of calm that other people borrow courage from. And then she died, and we were all significantly worse off. The rest of my section, there were 12 of us in total, I'll name as they become relevant, because naming them all now and then watching them disappear one by one through the telling feels like a cruelty I'd rather spread out. But I want you to have Henrik Plus, because Henrik is the other survivor. He was 22 years old at the time of the storm, fresh assigned from the training facility on Tethrak Station, still wearing the slightly stunned look of someone who'd just realized that the Navy is not, in fact, a good and noble institution full of opportunity, but is instead a very large machine that processes human beings the way a grinder processes grain and produces roughly similar results. He was too eager to please, too quick to startle, too honest in a place where honesty is a vulnerability. He had a habit of asking why about things, which got on everyone's nerves and which I privately respected because it meant his brain was still working. Most of us had stopped asking why years ago. When you're standing in Bilgewater at 3 in the morning, pulling a shift that started at 10 the previous evening, and the recycler system has broken down again, and the water is warm in a way recycled water shouldn't be warm. You stop asking why. You do the job. But Henrik kept asking, and in the storm, that habit of asking questions saved his life at least twice and almost killed him 3 more times. This was the crew I went into hell with. This was what I had to work with. I want you to remember that. The transit that killed us, or nearly killed us, or did kill us in every way that matters, and left something wearing our faces to walk back out the other side, started as a routine insertion. We were carrying a full regiment of Astra Militarum infantry, the Vethkar Rifles, 5th Regiment, to reinforce the garrison on Veth Secundus, which was having trouble with a chaos-afflicted population in its equatorial hive chains. Nothing unusual. The Contrition made supply runs to the Vethkar Reach every 2 years like clockwork. The mission profile called for a 14-day warp transit, translation to realspace, at the Mandeville point of Veth Secundus. Drop the troops, pick up any dispatches and priority cargo, and return to the fleet anchorage at Dunhold Station. Simple, routine, the kind of assignment that old hands use to relax and junior crew use to feel comfortable, and everyone uses to get bored. There were signs. There are always signs when you look back. But looking back at signs after the fact is the easiest thing in the world. The hard thing is seeing them while you're in them, while each sign looks like a coincidence or a malfunction or bad luck, while your rational mind is working very hard to provide explanations that fit inside a model of the universe where things make sense, and the warp is a road you can travel, and the dark between the stars is empty. The signs were there. I will list them not because I think it proves anything, but because they are facts, and I have committed myself to facts. 3 days before we entered the warp, the ship's navigator, Fricks of House Vaunt, a woman I had seen perhaps twice in 14 years, because navigators don't mingle with crew and live in their own sealed section near the ship's prow. She sent a formal written protest to Lord Captain Brennick Solus. I know this because Henrik was assigned to carry documents between the command deck and the navigator's sanctum that week. One of those administrative tasks that fell to junior armsmen, and he told me about it later. He hadn't read the document. Opening a sealed communique from a navigator would have been the last thing Henrik or anyone else ever did, but he understood the significance even without reading it. A navigator who needed to communicate urgently used the Vox. A navigator who committed her objection to writing and sent it through a physical courier was creating a formal record. She was building a document trail. That's what you do when you don't trust the Vox logs to survive unaltered, when you expect to be overruled and want evidence of it. He described the sanctum door opening just far enough for a pallid, long-fingered hand to thrust the sealed scroll case into his chest, and the hand was shaking. A navigator's hand. Shaking. That's the first sign. The second sign was in the response that came back 2 hours later through the same channel. Henrik brought the return document to the sanctum, and this time the door didn't open at all. The tube slot in the door accepted it. He stood there for a long moment after, he told me, because there was a sound coming through the door. He said it sounded like praying. Very fast, very low, the kind of praying that doesn't sound like reverence, but sounds like counting, like a man counting seconds before an impact, like words used as a mechanism rather than as devotion. He left quickly and didn't mention it to anyone except me much later. The third sign was Bast Kuhn's candles. The night before we entered the warp, he sat on his bunk and laid out his candles on the small shelf above his personal locker with more care than I'd ever seen him take before. He set them in a line, tallest to shortest, and he looked at them for a long time without lighting them. I asked him what was wrong. He was quiet for a moment. Bast was always quiet before he said something worth hearing. And then he said, "The ship doesn't want to go." I told him ships don't want things, they're machines, and he looked at me with those 30-year eyes and said this one does, and this one is right. Then he lit his candles, all 3 of them at once instead of the usual sequence, and the first one went out almost immediately. He relighted it. It went out again. He relighted it a 3rd time and held his hand around the flame and said something in a dialect I didn't recognize. The candles stayed lit. He was wrong, of course, or rather, he was right about what the ship wanted and wrong about what it would change. The Contrition didn't want to go into the warp that day. The Contrition knew something we didn't, but she didn't have a choice. None of us had a choice. The orders had been cut. The mission was active. Lord Captain Solus commanded one of the largest warships in Battlefleet Obscurus and additionally held sector patrol authority over the entire Vethkar supply corridor. A man who had spent 30 years becoming the kind of officer who does not alter mission profiles because a navigator is nervous. He was decisive in the way that command creates, which is to say decisive in ways that didn't always account for what the decision would cost. He understood exactly 2 states, mission in progress and mission complete. And this mission was in progress. Warp insertion is, for anyone who hasn't experienced it, and I hope you haven't, it is not like anything that happens in the physical world. There are descriptions of it in technical literature that use words like threshold transition and dimensional shear and Geller field cohesion protocols. And those words are accurate the way that the word water is accurate for the experience of drowning. Technically correct, entirely insufficient. What it actually feels like is this. You are standing in a corridor or at your post or in your bunk, and reality is solid and reliable and has edges, and then it doesn't. There is a moment. It lasts perhaps a second, perhaps less, where the light changes in a way that has no physical explanation. It goes slightly wrong. Not dark, not bright, not a color you could name, just wrong. And in that moment, if you're experienced enough and quiet enough in your mind, you can feel the hull breathing. The metal breathes in, and then the pressure equalizes and the light normalizes, and you're in the warp, and the universe you came from is somewhere behind you, and the only thing between you and everything that should not exist is the Geller field and the Emperor's grace. I'd made 11 warp transits before the Vethkar run. I knew what it felt like. The first few times I'd vomited. The next few I'd gritted through it. By the 11th, I barely noticed the moment of insertion beyond a slight headache that lasted about 10 minutes and a slight disorientation that made me clumsy for an hour. Experienced hands barely felt it at all. Bast said he'd stopped feeling it after the 3rd year. He said when you stopped feeling it was when you needed to start worrying again. He was right about that too. The first 48 hours of the transit were normal. The Geller field held at Sanctus. the optimal status tier that the Mechanicus designated with liturgical notation rather than any numerical measurement, a category that meant the field was coherent, stable, and performing as the Emperor and the Omnissiah intended. The Navigator was at her post in the sanctum, guiding us along the Astronomican beacon toward Veth Secundus. The crew was on standard rotation. Watch cycles of 8 hours, maintenance schedules running on time, the regiment of Vethkar rifles doing physical training in the lower hangar bays to keep themselves from going stir-crazy during the transit. My section was running standard armsmen duties, checkpoint patrols on the crew decks, prisoner processing for 2 ratings who'd gotten into a blade fight over a gambling debt, an escort detail for a senior Mechanicus priest who wanted to inspect the plasma manifold arrays on Deck 41. Normal work. Mind-numbing, purpose-giving, normal work. I want to spend a moment on normal because it matters that we had it. 2 days of it. I want you to understand what the inside of a battleship in warp transit looks like when everything is going right, because the contrast with what came after is important. It looks like any other city district after midnight. Not dead exactly, but thinned out. The main transit corridors have foot traffic at all hours because the ship runs on rotating shift cycles, and there is always a third of the crew somewhere in the middle of a working day regardless of what the ship's clocks say. The hangar bays where the Vethkar rifles were drilling had a kind of organized noise to them, boots on plascrete, the bark of sergeants running formations, the grunt of men doing work their bodies were designed for. The Mechanicus shrine sections were the quietest, always. That particular quality of silence that surrounds the tech priests who communicate in binaric cant below the threshold of human hearing and who regard speech as an inefficiency. The lower decks, the ones where the rated crew lived closest together, had the constant low noise of people in too small a space, voices, music from personal devices, the industrial hum of recycler systems that never quite went away. It was not comfortable. It was not pleasant. But it was known. It was the known quantity. And in the warp, the known quantity is everything. The warp is not nothing. The warp is the opposite of nothing. The warp is everything that ever was and ever will be and everything that never should have been, compressed into a dimension that runs alongside the real universe, like a shadow that's learned to have opinions. You are inside it. You are held away from it by the Geller field. And as long as the field holds status sanctus, the known quantity holds. The corridors are corridors. The ratings are ratings. The work is work. 2 days of that. 2 days of sufficient. The first anomaly came on the 3rd day. It was subtle enough that no one flagged it as significant. 2 ratings from the engine room reported to the medical station on Deck 12, complaining of identical dreams. This happens in the warp. Crew experience disrupted sleep, vivid nightmares, audio hallucinations that turn out to be nothing. There are standing orders about it. You report to the medical station. You get assessed by the ship's medici staff. You get given a sedative compound if necessary, and a notation in your service record, and you go back to your post. 2 ratings, same dream, was odd, but not alarming. The medici on Deck 12 logged it and moved on. What I know now and didn't know then was that those 2 ratings were not from the same dormitory. They weren't on the same work crew. They'd never spoken to each other before reporting to the Medici at nearly identical times. What they dreamed, and I read the Medici notes later after everything was over, when there was still a Medici station and still notes to read. What they dreamed was not a nightmare in the conventional sense. They dreamed of a corridor, a specific corridor. They both described it in detail. The shape of the ceiling, the configuration of the lighting panels, the sound of boots on grating. The corridor was on Deck 37, Section Cobalt 9, a maintenance passage near one of the secondary plasma feed lines, a corridor that both of them, independently, described as being already full of people who weren't moving. People standing very still in the dark, facing the wall. By the time the Medici thought to flag that detail as worth reporting to a superior officer, it was day 4, and by day 4 the storm had already found us. The storm didn't announce itself. That's the most important thing I want you to understand about warp weather, about what the navigators call Empyrean turbulence, and what the rest of us call by names I won't repeat in formal testimony. It doesn't come at you like a wave. It doesn't build up gradually the way a storm on a planet builds, with visible clouds and dropping air pressure and the smell of rain. In the warp, the first indication that something has gone catastrophically wrong is that something has already gone catastrophically wrong. The event and the warning arrive simultaneously. The storm was already inside us before we knew it was outside. Day 4. I was on patrol on Deck 22, Section Gold, which covered the crew habitation zone for approximately 3,000 rated personnel in the starboard section. Standard 4-hour patrol, nothing unusual in the first 2 hours. I had Henrik Plus with me. I'd taken to putting him on my patrol rotation because he was still green enough to need supervision, and I'd rather manage him directly than hear about him doing something catastrophically stupid from a sergeant. We were walking the main transit corridor, the long one, maybe 400 meters of lit passageway with dormitory hatches on either side, and the lights were doing what the lights always do in the warp, that very faint oscillation between warm and cold that most experienced crew learn to ignore. I'd been ignoring it for 14 years. But on the 4th day, the oscillation became something else, and I noticed it because it stopped being periodic and started being responsive. It was responding to sound. When Henrik spoke, the lights dimmed fractionally. When he stopped speaking, they normalized. I made him test it twice before I was willing to accept what I was seeing, and then I clicked my Vox link and started to call Sergeant Cashlin, and before I could get a word out, the Geller field alarm sounded. It's a specific sound, not like any other alarm on the ship. The general quarters alarm is a rising tone. The fire alert is a pulsing klaxon. The Geller field integrity warning is a sound that the ship's original designers apparently specified very deliberately, a sustained, harmonically flat note that has no musical precedent, neither high nor low, that sounds like something between a bell and a scream, and doesn't carry any echo because the ship's acoustics suppress it at the source. The effect is that you hear it as if it's coming from inside your own skull, rather than from the external speakers. Every experienced crew member knows this sound and has a specific, visceral response to it that training tries to direct into productive channels, and mostly fails. The productive channel response is, proceed immediately to your duty station, conduct weapons and equipment check, await orders. The actual response, before training kicks in, is absolute, complete, physical terror. The kind that empties your bowel and your mind simultaneously. Because the Geller field is the only reason you're alive. The Geller field is the thing between you and the warp, and everything in the warp. And when that alarm sounds, it means the field is failing. I grabbed Henrik by the collar and ran. Our duty station during Geller field alerts was Checkpoint 7 on Deck 20, which was one of the armsmen positions responsible for securing the passage between the inner hull zones and the habitation decks. The theory being that if the Geller field destabilizes and things get in, you don't want those things walking straight into the crew areas. You want a choke point. You want armsmen with weapons at the choke point. The logic is sound in the abstract. In practice, a choke point is also a place where two armsmen stand in a narrow corridor waiting for whatever is coming down that corridor, and the corridors on the Contrition are very long and very dark when the lights are behaving the way the lights were behaving on the 4th day. But that was my duty station, and I went to it, and I was good at my job. Sergeant Cashlin was already at Checkpoint 7 when we arrived. Bast Kuln was there. Two others from the section, Ovrak Dessel, a taciturn man from some Agri world I never learned the name of, and Thessaly Murn, a woman who'd been an armsman for 8 years and had a bionic left hand she'd gotten in a fire on a previous posting, and who used it, when she was nervous, to tap rhythms on her own thigh in irregular patterns that I assumed were some kind of unconscious comfort habit, but which Bast claimed were a language she was talking to herself in. Thessaly was tapping. Bast's candle was somehow lit. He had one of his small tallow candles in a glass holder clipped to his belt, which was technically against regulations, and which Sergeant Cashlin technically hadn't seen for 14 years. In the flickering corridor light, with the Geller field alarm still howling inside everyone's skull, that little candle was the most welcome sight I'd encountered in a long time. Cashlin gave us the briefing in the clipped, economical sentences she used when things were serious. The field had dropped to First Marginalis, the liturgical status tier the Mechanicus designated as initial degradation, below which active course correction became mandatory and spiritual countermeasures were authorized. Navigator Fricks of House Vaunt had sent a priority message to the command deck 7 minutes ago reporting unexpected Imperial turbulence of extreme intensity. The ship was altering course to seek a calmer transit path. Estimated stabilization time, unknown. Standing orders for Marginalis degradation were in effect. Armsmen to security posts, crew to dormitories, Mechanicus personnel to their shrines, the regiment's commissars and chaplains to begin morale operations on the troop decks. The Vethkar Rifles, our passenger regiment, had been ordered to their assigned berths, and their officers had been briefed. Everything was in hand, Cashlin said. Everything was being managed. I looked at Bast while she was saying this. He was looking at his candle. His expression was the one he used when he disagreed with an assessment, but didn't feel like arguing about it. I'd seen that expression during weapons maintenance inspections, during loadout briefings, during deck commander meetings, where someone senior was explaining why a procedure would definitely work. I'd seen it many times. I had never seen it as clearly as I saw it then, standing at Checkpoint 7, while the field held at First Marginalis, and the lights kept doing things that lights shouldn't do. The field dropped to Second Marginalis at hour 6. The Navigator increased course correction. The command deck sent a ship-wide address from Lord Captain Solus, a calm, measured speech about the long operational history of the Unyielding Contrition, about the resilience of her hull and crew, about the Emperor's protection that sailed with every vessel that carried his name. It was a good speech. I'd heard versions of it before, different captains, different ships, different degrees of crisis. Solus was better than most. He had a voice that sounded like it had been built for exactly this situation. Deep, unhurried, containing within it the premise that things were severe but manageable, that the distinction between severe and catastrophic was one that he personally intended to maintain. I listened to it standing at my post, and I almost believed it. The field dropped to Deep Marginalis at hour 9, and then something happened that no speech and no standing order had prepared any of us for. The lights stopped flickering. They went completely, absolutely off. Not a power failure. A power failure has a specific character, a sequence of systems shutting down in cascade, the emergency lumens clicking on a few seconds later with their sickly yellow glow. This wasn't that. This was absence. Immediate, total, uniform absence of light across the entirety of Deck 20, with every emergency system, every backup luminator, every bio-loom strip simultaneously failing to function. We were in complete darkness for 11 seconds. I know it was 11 because I counted. Counting is something you do when your mind needs an anchor. 1, 2, 3, 4. You count because numbers are real. Numbers don't change in the warp. 5, 6, 7. Numbers are the one true language of the universe. 8, 9, 10. Whatever is out there in the Empyrean can distort light and sound and memory and time, but it hasn't yet figured out how to make 11 come before 10. 11. The lights came back. Bast's candle was still burning. The first man to die was a ratings clerk named Ovin Sereth on Deck 23, Section Amber, 20 meters from the nearest checkpoint. He had locked himself in his dormitory as ordered. He had followed every protocol. When the lights went out, he had lit his emergency lumen stick and sat on his bunk and waited, which was exactly the right thing to do. The official report, which I read 3 weeks later when there was again an official anything, described his death as spontaneous cardiac failure secondary to extreme psychological stress. I know what that means in official language. I know what the Mechanicus priests who performed the initial examination actually said before someone edited the report to the language of cardiac failure. They said that his dormitory hatch was locked from the inside when they found him. They said his lumen stick was burning, still functioning, positioned on the floor 6 feet from his bunk. They said he was on his bunk, sitting upright, in a position that suggested he had not struggled. They said his eyes were open. They said the expression on his face was not the expression of a man who had died of fear. It was the expression of a man who had seen something he recognized. That was the beginning. One death, almost invisible in a ship of 47,000 rated crew. One small death in the vast dark body of the contrition, like a cell going wrong in a body that doesn't know yet it's sick. But bodies always know on some level. The contrition knew. The ship groaned that night in ways it had never groaned before. Not the settling sounds, not the structural communication of metal under stress, but something new, something that sounded, if you were in the right corridor at the right time with your ear against the hull, something that sounded almost like words. I was in the right corridor. I had my ear against the hull. I heard something. I didn't tell Sergeant Cachlin what I heard. I didn't tell Bast, though Bast might have understood. I kept it inside me like a coal I didn't want anyone to see burning. I kept it there for days. It became important later. Everything became important later. By day 6, the contrition was sick. I don't know a better way to say it. A ship that large, that old, that complicated. When something goes wrong with it, it goes wrong everywhere simultaneously, and in ways that make diagnosis nearly impossible. The Mechanicus priests were running between fault after fault, shrine to shrine, praying over systems and rewiring relays, and performing the proper rites of restoration. And it wasn't enough because the problem wasn't mechanical. The problem was the warp, and the warp doesn't respond to rites of restoration. The warp responds to nothing you try to do about it. The warp simply is, and you are in it, and what happens next is between you and whatever has decided to take an interest. The symptoms that a ship shows during severe Geller field degradation follow a pattern that the Adeptus Mechanicus have documented in technical texts classified above my clearance level, and that I know about only because Bast had been collecting rumor and second-hand knowledge for 30 years and had assembled something like a map of the process. I'm going to tell you what we observed and let the pattern speak for itself. Day 5. Crew in the lower decks began reporting sounds in sections that had no crew, not mechanical sounds. Voices, distant, indistinct, sometimes in languages no one could identify, sometimes in perfectly recognizable Imperial Gothic, but speaking sentences that didn't make sense. Day 5 also. 17 separate crew members reported seeing figures in corridors that turned out, when investigated, to contain no one. The figures were described consistently as tall and still and wrong in proportion in ways the witnesses found difficult to articulate. Several witnesses independently used the phrase "not finished" to describe the appearance of the figures, as if they were sketches of people rather than people. Day 6. The first cluster madness. 6 ratings from the same dormitory block, Deck 15, Section Viridian, were found in a state of catatonia that the medici could not explain. They were sitting in a circle on the floor of their dormitory, facing inward, and none of them responded to any stimulus. Their eyes were open and tracking each other, following some kind of movement in the center of the circle that the medici personnel who found them could not see. They were separated and placed in medical restraints and given pharmacological sedation. 2 of them died. 3 recovered eventually, physically. One of the survivors never spoke again in a language anyone recognized, though she spoke constantly, always the same cadence, always just below the threshold of comprehension. Day 6 also, the first outbreak of violence. Not a brawl, not the kind of blade fights over gambling debts that were a constant background noise of ship life. Something else. A rating on Deck 18 murdered his bunkmate with a sharpened coolant pipe fitting in the middle of the night and then sat down next to the body and began calmly explaining, to no one visible, why it had been necessary. The armsman who responded found him mid-explanation, gesturing, making the careful, measured movements of a man making a persuasive argument. When they restrained him, he looked at them with genuine confusion and asked why they were interrupting. He was sent to the brig. He died there of unexplained causes 6 hours later. The armsman who had custody of the brig that night, a man named Colin Vrass from Section 5, submitted his report the next morning and then went to the ablutions block and didn't come out. When we broke the door down, he was fine, physically. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his arms folded over his knees, and he told us very quietly that he'd heard the murderer talking to himself all through his custody shift, and that at some point during the night, he'd realized the murderer wasn't talking to himself at all, that there was something in the cell talking back, and that he'd heard what the something said. Vrass wouldn't tell us what it said. He served out the rest of the storm in his bunk under sedation, with 3 Emperor's candles burning and Bast Khon sitting beside him for most of it. He survived. He was not all right. There's a distinction there that I want you to hold on to. The Geller field reached first damnatus on Day 7. The Mechanicus liturgical categories for field degradation had, from the armsman's perspective, one practical meaning at each tier. Each one told you roughly how long you had before the field stopped being a field and started being a prayer. First, damnatus meant the field was compromised enough that the Mechanicus priests changed from maintenance rituals to emergency ward rites. It meant the regiment's commissars were authorized to conduct summary field judgment without formal tribunal, the specific kind of authorization that tells every soldier in earshot that the threshold for what constitutes a punishable deviation has just dropped considerably, and that the commissars have the authority to enforce it on the spot. It meant every access point to critical systems was sealed with triple-locking cogitator-managed hatches that required 3 separate authorization keys to open. All non-essential crew to armored dormitory sections, all armsmen to combat configuration, all priests, confessors, and Ministorum representatives were authorized to deliver spiritual guidance by Vox rather than in person, with one specific exception. Vorveld held a standing command deck pastoral dispensation signed by Lord Captain Solus himself that authorized him to conduct in-person morale operations in critical areas at his own discretion. The logic behind it was sound. You cannot talk a man back from the edge through a crackling speaker, and Vorveld had always been more effective in the flesh. 6 years of being granted that latitude, 6 years of the ship's command structure trusting him enough to give him access that no other priest aboard possessed. Nobody thought to revoke it when crisis protocol activated. Why would they? He was Vorveld. It also meant that the Navigator was formally petitioned to provide a navigational threat assessment from which the Lord Captain would declare one of three operational states: turbulence manageable, transit continuation advised, turbulence extreme, emergency egress, under advisement, or the one that nobody wants to see on the ship's status board. Navigator Fricks of House Vaunt submitted her assessment at 0400 hours on day 7. Empyrean conditions met the threshold for warp storm engagement. She formally recommended emergency warp translation back to realspace at the earliest opportunity. Under the protocols, Lord Captain Solus received that assessment and had sole authority to declare the operational state and act on it. His response to that recommendation took 2 hours to arrive, which was 2 hours longer than it should have taken. When it came, it said, "Navigator Vaunt, your recommendation is noted. Transit continues pending review. Full field integrity reports to command deck every 30 minutes. Solus, Lord Captain, commanding. Pending review. Pending review while the field was at first damnatus, and the walls were talking. I need to tell you about Confessor Thane Vorveld here, because he becomes important very quickly from this point, and I want you to have the right picture of him before I tell you what he did. Vorveld was the ship's senior confessor. Not a space marine chaplain, not a commissar, but a Ministorum priest whose specific function was the spiritual maintenance of the crew. He'd been on the Contrition for 6 years. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, built for a pulpit or a parade ground rather than for the cramped corridors of a battleship. But he'd adapted with an ease that suggested he'd been in worse places. He had a preacher's face, strong jaw, deep-set eyes, the kind of weathered skin that comes from standing in bad weather and not going inside. He spoke well. When he walked the crew decks during normal transit, he walked without guards, without ceremony, stopping to speak to individual ratings, learning names, and remembering them. The kind of pastoral work that most confessors on large ships reduce to formal sermons and leave at that. He was liked. He was trusted. He was the one you wanted at the front of a crowd that was about to become a mob, because he could talk them back. When the storm hit and the crisis protocol went into effect, Vorveld was everywhere, moving through the ship under his pastoral dispensation, on the Vox every few hours, reading from the Lectitio Divinitatus, leading collective prayers that echoed through the corridors, even in sections where the speakers were malfunctioning and the sound came out distorted and wrong. He organized the armsmen into rotating prayer escort details, personally visiting the highest stress areas. The Medici decks, where the catatonic ratings were housed. The brig, the lower decks, where the cluster madness had been worst. He stood at the front of it all with his preacher's face and his confident voice, and he was the thing holding the crew together while the Geller field failed, and the walls talked, and the dead were found in locked rooms. I believed in him. I want to be very clear about that because what comes later needs that context. I believed in him the way that I believed the ship's hull was sound, and the way I believed Sergeant Cashglin's orders were worth following, as a solid fact in an environment that was becoming increasingly made of not facts. There were specific things he did in those early days of the crisis that, when I trace them back now with what I know, reveal themselves as precise and calculated, but which in the moment looked like exactly the kind of pastoral excellence that a man of his rank was supposed to provide. He found Henrik Plus on day 5 and spoke to him for 20 minutes in a maintenance alcove on deck 16, while Henrik was having a crisis of faith. Not the religious kind, the practical kind, the kind where your body understands viscerally that the thing you're in is too large and too broken and too full of things that should not exist, and your mind is failing to supply any argument for why you should continue to function. Vorveld found him and sat with him and said the right things in the right order with the right pauses and the right look in the deep-set eyes. And Henrik came back from that conversation with the posture of a man who'd decided to keep going. I know this because Henrik told me about it afterward. He said, "The Confessor told me that the Emperor's light was in every man who chose to stand, that the Geller field wasn't the only thing between us and the warp, that we were also between us and the warp. Every man and woman on the ship holding the line." He said it like it was fact and not comfort, and Henrik said he felt it was both. I thought, good. Good that we have this man on our ship in this storm. That is what I thought. That is the specific thought I had. I've given it a great deal of consideration since, the question of what kind of mind is required to have thought the opposite. I don't have an answer that satisfies me. I'm not sure I want one. On day 8, Navigator Fricks of House Vaunt stopped sending field integrity reports. The command deck spent 4 hours trying to raise her by Vox before they sent an armsman detail to the Navigator's sanctum. I know this because I was the senior armsman on watch by then. Sergeant Cashlin had been temporarily assigned to command deck escort, and Bast Kuln had been assigned to the Mechanicus detail with Vrass, so I was holding the section. Bast came back from that detail under his own authority late on day 8, told me the Mechanicus had enough hands and that he'd felt more useful moving. I wasn't going to argue with him. I needed the bodies. I sent the detail. Ovrak Dessel led it. 4 armsmen to the Navigator's sanctum on deck 7, forward section. 20 minutes travel time. I waited at the checkpoint 7 Vox station and listened to the calm silence. They got to the sanctum. The outer door was sealed from the inside. Navigator's sanctums are equipped with independent locking systems precisely for situations like this, situations where things might be in the corridors that the Navigator does not want in the sanctum. This is standard. What was not standard was that the door-mounted Vox unit, which allows communication with the sanctum without opening the door, was broadcasting something when Dessel's team arrived, broadcasting continuously on a loop without a transmission key being held. Dessel called it in. I had to turn up my Vox gain to hear it, and then I wished I hadn't turned it up. The Navigator's voice, I had heard her voice before in official briefings, a precise, slightly hollow quality, the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to carefully. Her voice was playing on a loop from the sanctum door speaker, the same 7 words over and over. 7 words in Imperial Gothic, perfectly clear, without inflection, without any of the weight of understanding that a person puts into words. Just words, cycling. I am going somewhere you cannot follow. I am going somewhere you cannot follow. I am going somewhere you cannot follow. Dessel broke down the door with a breaching charge. The sanctum was empty. Not empty of furniture or equipment. The Navigator's chair, the charting systems, the navigation shrines, the Astronomicon link array, all present and undisturbed. Empty of the Navigator. Fricks of House Vaunt was not in the sanctum. She was not in any adjacent section. She was nowhere on any ship's manifest or scanner sweep for the entirety of the remaining transit. She simply was not there. The Vox unit on the door was still broadcasting when Dessel called in the empty room. He stood there in the Navigator's sanctum doorway, and I could hear the loop playing behind his voice. I am going somewhere you cannot follow. I am going somewhere you cannot follow. I am going somewhere you cannot follow. I asked Dessel to disconnect the Vox unit. He did. The loop stopped. Without the Navigator, the ship could not actively steer through the warp. She would continue on her last set heading until the warp itself changed that heading. She was in a storm. The warp would change the heading. There was nothing, mechanically or otherwise, that could be done about this except to wait for the Geller field to hold long enough for an emergency warp translation to be initiated, and for that you needed either the Navigator in her chair or a Mechanicus override that the Contrition's Archmagos had been telling the command deck was 15 minutes away for the past 6 hours. We were adrift in the storm. We were without a navigator. The field was deep into damnatus, and the crew of 47,000 were in various stages of spiritual and psychological deterioration, and we were being pushed wherever the storm wanted to push us. That was day 8. That was when I stopped believing we were going to get out. The Archmagos, the senior Mechanicus authority who had been promising the command deck an emergency override for the better part of a day, stopped responding to the command deck vox the following morning. His body was found 2 days after that in the primary shrine complex. In circumstances, the surviving junior adept's anomaly notation described only as consistent with Empyrean exposure. Days 9 through 11. I'm going to try to tell you this in order, but I want to warn you that order becomes difficult to maintain when you're talking about warp exposure at this level. Memory works strangely after you've been through it. Not like amnesia. I remember everything in fine sensory detail, which is its own kind of damage, but the sequence becomes slippery. Things that I know happened on day 10 feel like they happened on day 11. Things that I know must have happened before other things somehow feel simultaneous. The Mechanicus have a term for this. They call it temporal dissociation, secondary to Empyrean exposure. What they mean is that the warp messes with time, and time messes with memory, and the result is a human mind that contains all the right information in a slightly wrong order. Bear with me. I want to say something about the Vethkar rifles before I go further, because I've told you almost nothing about them, and you may be wondering what 5,000 trained Astra Militarum infantry were doing while the ship died around them. The short answer is, we don't know entirely, and the regimental records didn't survive in complete form. What I know from the armsmen who had contact with the troop decks is this. On day 7, when the crisis protocol locked down the troop berths, the rifles were already showing cluster incidents in 2 of their companies. The same kind of shared dream madness that had started among the ratings, but progressing faster in men who'd spent time in the equatorial hive chains of Veth Secundus and arrived on the ship already carrying something none of us knew to look for. Their commissars handled it the way commissars handle things, decisively, with finality. By day 10, the rifles had lost their regimental command structure and their companies had turned inward, each surviving company holding its own berth section, maintaining internal order by whatever means still worked, not taking orders from anyone outside their immediate officer chain because the Vox was unreliable and the corridors between berths were no longer safe transit. They fought their own war in those berths for 9 days. 60% losses. When we came out the other side, the companies that had held were holding by the same logic we were holding by: unit cohesion, habit of discipline, and the specific stubbornness of men who had decided not to be taken. I respect that. I never had the chance to say so to any of them directly. The logistics of the post-translation period didn't allow for it, but I want it in the record. The first demon manifested on day 9. I want to use the proper word because the proper word is what it was. Not a warp entity, not an anomalous life form, not an Empyrean intrusion of non-corporeal origin. A demon. A thing from the warp that had pushed through the failing Geller field and was now on the ship and had a body of some kind and was doing what demons do. I was not present at the first manifestation. I was at my post, but I received the Vox report from Armsman Sergeant Davin Grail on Deck 30, who was present, and I'm going to tell you what he told me because Grail was a 15-year veteran and did not embellish and did not panic, and the report he gave me was the most terrifying thing I have ever heard spoken in a level voice. I remember it exactly, word for word in sequence, without the temporal slippage I mentioned. I think it's because he gave it to me in the language I understood best. Flat, ordered, professional. My mind kept it the way it keeps tactical information. not the way it keeps the rest of those days. Grail was on patrol in Deck 30, Section Ferris, which was one of the secondary cargo sections. He and his patrol team of 3, all experienced armsmen, were doing a standard sweep when they encountered a rating from the cargo team standing in the middle of the main transit corridor, facing away from them, not moving. Grail called out. The rating turned around. Grail said that the turning was wrong. Not wrong in any way he could have predicted, but the rating turned 180 degrees without the normal sequence of physical movements that a body makes when it turns. It turned as if rotation itself was the only action required, and the body was just completing the minimum necessary motion to achieve it. He said the face was the rating's face. Same features. Same tattoo on the left cheek. Grail had checked the service records afterward, same tattoo. But the face was doing something faces don't do. He said it was cycling, moving through expressions the way a display screen cycles through test patterns, not randomly in sequence, each expression held for exactly the same fraction of a second before the next. Fear, surprise, grief, anger, joy, over and over. His team opened K immediately. That's the training. You see something like that, you don't hesitate, you don't deliberate, you fire. They put 12 rounds into it, and it took the rounds without falling, and then Grail hit it with everything his combat shotgun had, and it fell and stopped moving and stopped cycling. His team checked the body. It was a body. The Mechanicus autopsy later found nothing their instruments could measure or name beyond the wound damage. Whatever had been using that body had left when the body stopped working, which is either reassuring or not reassuring depending on where you think it went. There were 11 more manifestations reported in the 48 hours after Grail's. They varied. Not all of them were possessions of existing crew. Some were described as things that appeared from nowhere, that had no physical substrate that anyone could identify, that existed in the spaces between where things should be, and which sometimes responded to weapons and sometimes did not. The pattern. And I kept looking for patterns because patterns meant I could think about it, and thinking about it meant I had some kind of relationship to it that wasn't just being acted upon. The pattern I identified was that they were testing, not attacking in any sustained, coordinated way, appearing, observing, withdrawing, or being destroyed, as if whatever was pushing through the field was still calibrating, still figuring out what we were and what we do. The armsman casualties in those 48 hours were 9 dead and 14 wounded, of the roughly 300 armsmen currently operational across the ship. The wounded included 6 cases of what the Mechanicus described as acute psychological trauma, men and women who'd encountered manifestations and fired on them and survived physically, but had left some piece of their mental stability on the deck where it happened. They were treated as well as anyone could be treated and returned to their posts because there wasn't another option. You don't have the luxury of long-term psychological recovery when the field is deep into damnatus and there are demons in the corridors. You give them what you can, you put them back on the line, and you hope the work keeps them functional. For most of them, it did. Work is a mercy in those conditions. Standing still and having nothing to do is when the mind turns on itself. Motion is survival. One of those encounters, not Grail's, a later one, I was present for, and I want to tell you about it because it illustrates something specific about what the warp does that no briefing document ever quite manages to communicate. My fire team was clearing Section Amber 2 on Deck 18, which had been flagged as a manifestation hotspot based on the sighting reports we'd been aggregating. We moved in standard formation, 2 ahead, 2 covering, 2 holding the rear junction. and we swept each compartment as we went, the way you sweep any unfamiliar space, methodical, unhurried, with the particular quality of attention that strips away assumption and just observes. The first 7 compartments were empty in the way compartments are supposed to be empty. The 8th compartment was not. There was a figure at the far end of it, standing near the bulkhead, and it was the right height and the right shape, and wearing the right clothes for a Deck 18 rating, and my first instinct was, straggler, miss the confinement order, get them back to their dormitory. I called out, standard challenge. The figure didn't move. I called again. The figure turned around, and the face was Sergeant Cashlin's face. Not a face like her face. Her face, precisely, with the level flat eyes and the strong jaw and the set of the mouth that I'd known for 8 years. Mira Cashlin was on Deck 7 at that moment. I knew exactly where she was. I'd spoken to her 40 minutes before. But the face in that compartment was hers, and it looked at me with her eyes, and it said, in her voice, with her cadence, "You should have listened when the ship told you to turn back." And then it wasn't there anymore. Not gone in any visible way. It was simply no longer present in the space it had occupied. I stood in the compartment doorway for a moment that I'm not sure I can accurately measure in seconds, and then I called it in and we continued the sweep, and I did not mention to anyone, then or later, that the face had been hers. There are things you don't say in a crisis. There are things you hold back because saying them out loud would cost the people around you something they can't afford to spend. But I heard it, and the voice was right. And I've thought about it many times since. What the ship told me, what I should have been listening to. Sergeant Mira Cacklin came back from her command deck assignment on day 10. She came back different, and I didn't notice immediately, which I consider a failure on my part. She told me later that Solus had dismissed her escort detail on day 9, told them the command deck was secure, and he had no further need of them. She said he'd been very calm about it. She said he'd been very calm about everything from day 8 onward, in a way that was worse than panic. She was quieter than usual, not subdued exactly, more compressed, as if someone had taken the Cachlin I knew and reduced her by 10% in all dimensions. She resumed command of the section without comment. She gave orders in her usual flat, clear voice. She conducted a weapons check that was flawless. But she didn't look at Bast Kuln. For 2 days, through all of it, she didn't look at him directly. Bast noticed. He didn't say anything. He watched her. On day 11, she told us about what she'd seen on the command deck. She told us at a checkpoint briefing, standing in the half-dark of checkpoint 7, with her hands behind her back, and her voice doing the thing where it doesn't change tone, regardless of what the words are doing. She said, "The command deck has been receiving transmissions, warp origin, non-standard frequency, coming through the cogitator manifold receiving arrays. The hardware that logs and processes Imperial signal, which kept cycling even with the choir in full isolation since day 5. The astropaths couldn't intercept or translate it. They were sealed and sedated, the correct protocol, but the hardware didn't need them. The cogitator banks were receiving and logging something, but not fully decoding it, because something about the data structure didn't conform to any protocol in the ship's library. She said, "Command has been running those transmissions through every analysis suite available, and the only consistent output from the analysis is coordinates." She said, "The coordinates are not Veth Secundus." She said, "The coordinates are somewhere inside the storm." I asked her what was at the coordinates. She said, "We don't know." Then she said, "The Navigator's chair has been active. The Astronomican link array, the navigation systems, they've been running on their own since Vaunt disappeared, running and making adjustments to the ship's heading. Not large adjustments, but adjustments." She said, "We are not traveling to Veth Secundus," she said. "We have not been traveling to Veth Secundus since day 8. She said it the same way she'd have said your post-rotation has been adjusted, level, flat, entirely without the weight of what she was telling us. We were being navigated, without a navigator, by the ship itself, towards something in the storm." Bast Kon lit a 4th candle that night. Day 12 was the worst day for crew casualties, and also the day I stopped being able to run a formal patrol rotation, because the corridors were no longer reliably safe for anything smaller than a 5-armsman fire team. The manifestations had shifted from testing to something more active and more structured. They were following routes. They moved through the ship's transit arteries in the same direction, toward the same general area. I drew it on a deck plan when I had a moment at the checkpoint, plotted the reported manifestation sightings by location and time, and drew the implied vectors. And the picture that emerged was unmistakable. Everything was moving toward the ship's core. Everything was moving toward the section that contained, among other things, the plasma reactor, the command deck, and the ship's primary Mechanicus shrine complex. Everything was moving toward the heart of the contrition. On day 12, Thessaly Myrn was killed. She was on patrol with a 5-armsman team in Section Cobalt on Deck 22, and she turned a corner ahead of the team and did not come back around the corner. They found her equipment, her shotgun and her kit and her armor, neatly arranged, stacked, in the middle of the corridor, stacked with a care that took deliberate effort. Her bionic hand was resting on top of the stack with the fingers extended, and it was still tapping. Irregular rhythms, tapping against her own shotgun stock. Her squad leader said it didn't stop for 45 minutes. He said it didn't speed up or slow down or change pattern. Just the same irregular rhythm, over and over, like a message no one knew how to read. Ovrak Dessel went silent on day 12. Not mute, not physically unable to speak, just stopped speaking, stopped responding to direct address, completed his duties in full silence with his eyes fixed on a middle distance that wasn't the middle distance of the corridor he was standing in. He ate when food was placed in front of him. He moved when directed. He followed orders in the way that a machine follows orders. But whatever Ovrak Dessel had been before day 12, the specific arrangement of personality and experience and habit that had made him Ovrak from some agri-world who fixed his equipment with unusual care and never complained about post-rotations, that was gone. I don't know where it went. I suspect I know what took it. I couldn't prove that then. I can't prove it now. Days 13, 14, 15. I am not going to give you a detailed account of those 3 days because I don't fully have one. The same pattern that I've described, corridor sweeps, checkpoint holds, casualties absorbed, the steady reduction of functional personnel, continued at a pace that had become almost routine by virtue of being relentless. Routine is the wrong word. What I mean is that the human capacity to adapt to horror as a baseline is one of the most disturbing things I discovered about myself in those days. You can get used to demons in the corridors. You can get used to people not coming back from patrols. You can get used to counting heads at the start of each rotation and not expecting the number to hold. You don't stop being frightened. But the fear becomes structural rather than acute. The background material your actions are built on rather than a response to specific events. We held the checkpoint. We walked our corridors. We held. Mira Kachlin led the section through those days, through 12, 13, 14, 15, with a precision that stopped my breath when I thought about it later and fully understood what it cost her. She was not well, she had told me herself on day 11, that everything she looked at showed her a layer beneath the surface, that she was experiencing the world as a palimpsest where the real version and something else beneath it were both visible simultaneously. And yet, She posted fire teams at every junction. She managed our dwindling ammunition through a rationing system that showed she'd been running the numbers for days. She coordinated with the 3 other section sergeants who were still operational on our deck, keeping patrol vectors clear and response times predictable when nothing else on the ship was predictable. She did all of this while seeing through the floor she was standing on and through the faces of the people she was talking to, while the only stable thing in her visual field was a single tallow candle she was not allowed to acknowledge. What she accomplished through those days was the most remarkable thing I witnessed in 19 days of remarkable things, and I want it in the record that she did it, that she chose to do it, that she had the architecture of a soldier so well built that it held her upright even when everything inside was failing. When she finally told me what was wrong with her, on the night of day 15, lying against the bulkhead at checkpoint 7, with her knees pulled up and her eyes closed in the not-quite sleep of the perpetually vigilant, she said it almost without inflection. She said, "I think I saw something on the command deck that I wasn't supposed to see." She said, "I think I've been seeing it since. Not always, but enough." She said, "I don't think the Emperor's light reaches this far into the storm, Dak. I don't think the Astronomicon goes this deep." I told her she was wrong. I told her I believed the Emperor's light went everywhere because it had to, because if it didn't, then nothing we were doing meant anything and all of it was done. I believed it when I said it. I still believe it when I say it now. But I know what she meant, and I know she was right about one thing. The Astronomicon was further away than it had ever been, and the contrition was still moving toward the coordinates in the storm. She died the next morning. Day 16. She was alone when it happened. She'd sent the section for a rest period, taken the watch herself, the kind of self-sacrificing thing she did regularly, and that everyone knew she did, and that no one could stop her from doing. I found her at checkpoint 7 when I came on at the start of the next rotation. She was at the post. Her weapon was in her hands. Her eyes were open. She looked like a person standing watch, except she wasn't standing. She was down on one knee in a position that didn't suggest collapse, but instead suggested prayer, deliberate, a choice to kneel. Her eyes were open, and they were looking at the corridor ahead, and her expression was the same expression I'd seen on Henrik Plus's face the first time the lights went wrong. Open, receptive, entirely without fear, like someone receiving news they'd been waiting for. There was no wound. There was nothing physically wrong with her. She had simply stopped. I held her hand for a moment. Not protocol, not useful. I held her hand and I said the standard words, the proper forms, the commendation to the Emperor, the words that send a soldier forward. And then I stood up and I looked at the section. Of the 12 of us who had started, Caslin was gone and Thessaly was gone, and 2 others whose names I will not omit entirely, Pret Sovath and Illis Kern, both armsmen 1st grade, both stationed with us since before my time, had been lost on day 10 and day 11 respectively, in ways I did not have enough of myself left to describe in this account. Dessel was standing and breathing, but present in no other meaningful sense. That left Henrik, 2 others I barely knew, and me. I was not the ranking grade, but I was the one still capable of making decisions, and on day 16 of a warp storm that was eating the ship, capability is the only rank that matters. I took command of the section, because that was what she would have done, because there was no other option. Because that is what it means to be an armsman on a dying ship in a storm that is eating the world. You hold the checkpoint. You hold it until you can't. And then someone else holds it. I held it. The truth about Confessor Vorveld came to me through Bast Kuln, who had been carrying it for days and had been trying to figure out how to say it without sounding like a man who'd lost his mind. He chose day 16 after Cathlin's death because he said he thought we'd run out of time to be careful with it. He sat down across from me at checkpoint 7, and he said, "I've been watching Vorveld since day 8. I said, "Watching him how?" He said, "The way I watch things I don't trust." I said, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "A man accuses a confessor of heresy during a warp storm. He needs to be more than suspicious. He needs to be certain enough to be believed over a man everyone trusts. I've seen what happens when you name a senior priest as corrupted, and you're wrong. Or worse, when you're right but nobody believes you yet. I needed the map finished. I'm sorry it took this long, Dak." That was Bast. 30 years, and he still thought every move through to its third consequence before he made it. He said, "Do you know how many crew Vorveld has moved through the ship's transit system since the crisis protocol went into effect using his dispensation?" I said, "He's been doing pastoral rounds." He said, "Yes. And every single one of those rounds has brought a cluster of crew into a specific location and left them there and moved on." He laid a deck plan on the checkpoint console that I recognized as one he'd drawn himself, covered in his cramped annotation marks. He said, "Look at the pattern." I looked. I'm a soldier. I know patterns of movement and distribution the way a carpenter knows the grain of wood, by sight, by feel, without having to stop and calculate. What Bast's map showed me was not pastoral rounds. What it showed me was a formation. Specific positions occupied by clusters of selected crew distributed across 8 decks of the ship in a pattern that required deliberate placement, that would have required coordination and pre-selection of individuals, and that described a shape around the ship's core, the reactor, the shrines, the Navigator's sanctum. A shape that I recognized from nothing I could name consciously, but which I recognized the way you recognize a word in a language you barely speak, because you've heard it spoken often enough in the right context. The word it described was convergence. It was a diagram of convergence. It was a net being drawn closed. I asked Bast how many of the people in those positions were still alive and in position. Most of them. The ones who've died haven't been in position. It's like they're being protected. Not all of them know what they're part of, I think. Some of them are just people who believed the confessor when he told them to stay in a specific place because it was spiritually significant. Some of them are more than that. He said, "I think he's been building toward something, and I think it's very close to ready." I asked him how sure he was. He looked at me with 30 years in his eyes and said, "Sure enough." I left Henrik Plus in charge of the checkpoint with Ovrak Dessel. Useless Dessel, silent Dessel. But a body with a weapon was still a body with a weapon, and I took Bast and 2 of the 5 remaining functional armsmen in my section, and I went to find Confessor Vorveld. Finding him took 2 more days. I want to say that plainly because it matters to the accounting. 2 days of moving through corridors that had become something other than corridors, spaces that shifted configuration between one transit and the next, where the manifestations were no longer testing or even attacking in any coherent tactical sense, but simply present, part of the ship's geography. The way bulkheads were part of the ship's geography, endured and worked around. Bast's map told us where Vorveld should be, which section, which shrine room. The ship's geometry kept changing around the map. Twice we reached a location that matched the map exactly and found nothing except the smell of tallow and old fabric, and something else that I do not have words for that was not either of those things. On the second day we lost another man, Talvris Orek from Section 7, a steady armsman who had made it through 16 days without breaking, and who died on day 17 in a corridor on deck 14, in circumstances his partner could not describe with any coherence when I debriefed him afterward. The partner survived. He did not stay sane. I note Orek's name here because he was the last armsman under my command to die before the end, and because lists of names are the only monument available to men who die in dark corridors on ships that do not remember them. On the 19th day, we found him. Deck 8, Section Oriat 3, which was one of the secondary Ministorum shrine rooms, a long, vaulted chamber originally designed for crew religious observance, lined with carved aquillas and illuminated by banks of devotional lumens that cast everything in gold and orange warmth. It was the warmest, brightest space I'd been in since the storm started, and the warmth and brightness felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately explain before I understood that it was wrong, because nothing warm and bright had any right to be on this ship at this moment. It was a pocket of comfort in the middle of a dying vessel, and it should have been comforting, and it was the opposite. Vorveld was at the altar. He was in his full vestments, heavy fabric, the chasuble worked with Aquila and High Gothic scripture, the formal headdress of a senior confessor. He had his back to us when we entered. He was speaking not loudly, the same rapid counting prayer cadence that Henrik had heard through the Navigator's door 3 days before we entered the warp. I did not register the connection until much later. I have not finished deciding what it means. Either Vorveld had been present outside the Navigator's sanctum in those days before insertion, for reasons I cannot explain, or Fricks of House Vaunt had been speaking in the same ritual language. I do not know which possibility troubles me more. He was also not alone. There were 11 people in the shrine room with him, crew members, some in rating work clothes, some in maintenance overalls, one in light officer uniform, arranged along the 2 side walls in a configuration that mirrored exactly one segment of Bast's map. They were still. They were not catatonic. Their eyes were open and following Vorveld, following him very carefully, with the focused attention of people performing a task they understood and had trained for. One of them looked at me when I came in, specifically at me, not at the group of us, and he smiled in a way that wasn't a threat and wasn't a greeting. It was recognition. The smile of a man who has been expecting a specific person at a specific time and is gratified to see the schedule is on track. I raised my weapon. I said, "Confessor Vorveld, by the authority of Armsman Command Deck Security, I am ordering you to step away from the altar and face me." He stopped speaking. The room went very quiet. Then he turned around and his face was exactly as I remembered it. Preacher's face, strong jaw, deep-set eyes. But the deep-set eyes were wrong. Not wrong the way the rating in Grail's report had been wrong, not cycling, not obviously demonic. Wrong in a subtler way. The way a very good copy of something is wrong. The proportions are right, the details are there, but the quality of light that falls on it is different, as if the original had a specific warmth, and this version didn't know it was supposed to replicate that too. He said, "Armsman Thurren, you are earlier than I expected, which is either to your credit or mine. I haven't decided." He said it in Vorveld's voice, with Vorveld's cadence, with a kind of rueful precision that sounded like Vorveld. And that was the worst version of wrong. Not a demon in a borrowed suit of skin, not something that had abandoned all pretense. Something that still knew how to sound like a person. "I want you to understand that what I'm doing is not betrayal," he said. "The Emperor built this ship as a weapon, and weapons have purposes, and purposes sometimes require the weapon to go places the weapon would prefer not to go. The storm was always going to come to this ship. I simply arranged for it to find what it was looking for more efficiently." He said, "Consider it a negotiation. The Imperium takes what it is owed, and in exchange, those who facilitate the transaction survive." He said this in Vorveld's reasonable, considered voice, and the people along the walls listened with their careful, trained attention. I shot the man who had smiled at me first, because he was the nearest. Then I shot 2 more. Then the room stopped being a conversation. What followed I am going to describe in the language of a weapons engagement report, because that is the discipline that got me through it, and the discipline that I still use when I need to access those minutes without being consumed by them. We engaged 8 combatants in the shrine room, of whom 5 were carrying weapons of varying quality. Bast killed 2, I killed 3. One of our armsmen, Petar Calvi from Section 3, was killed by a modified lascutter that one of the robed crew had concealed under their vestments. The 8th combatant did not fight. The 8th knelt on the floor and began praying loudly, formally, the correct words of the correct litanies of the Imperial Creed, and we left her there. I want to be honest about that decision because it does not look correct by the standards of any field security protocol I was trained under. I should have detained her. I should have at minimum restrained her until someone with the authority to assess her could do so. What I did instead was make the decision that a woman on her knees, speaking the right words in the right order, was not the most immediate problem I had in those 60 seconds, and I kept moving. I do not know what became of her. She was not among the survivors logged at the translation point, whether that means she was a combatant who died in the field status collapse, or an innocent who died because I did not stop to secure her, or something else entirely, I cannot tell you. I have carried that uncertainty. I expect I always will. Vorveld himself, during the engagement, stepped backward toward the altar and pressed his palm against the carved surface and said something in a language I didn't recognize. Not the fragment of unknown language from the manifestations. Something different, older, more structured. And the room changed. Not visually, not audibly. The room changed in the way a face changes when the expression drains out of it. It went neutral in a way rooms aren't supposed to be neutral. And then Vorveld disappeared. Not fled, not ran. Disappeared. Between 1 second and the next, the vestments were on the floor and he was not in them. I want to be precise here because I've spent a long time thinking about what that moment actually was. He said the Empyrean takes what it is owed. He said those who facilitate the transaction survive. I believe he believed both of those things when he entered this ship's service and began building toward this moment. I believe he built his 6 years of trust and his ritual and his map of crew positions convinced that the entity he served would honor those terms. And I believe that at the moment of completion, the moment he pressed his palm to the altar and spoke the words, the thing he had spent 6 years negotiating with took what it came for, including Vorveld himself, and left his vestments on the floor as the only receipt. The negotiation with the warp ended the way negotiations with the warp always end. He found that out at the very last moment, and I hope for whatever remains of his soul that the finding was fast. The cogitator panels in the shrine room cycled through 3 rapid changes. Field status, damnatus, deep. Field status, condemnus. Field status, mortis. Catastrophic failure, insufficient for sustained transit. Prepare for emergency translation. I grabbed Bast's arm and ran. The cogitator announcement for emergency warp translation runs on a 60-second countdown from the moment mortis status is declared. 60 seconds to brace for translation back into real space, to secure loose equipment, to get away from hull sections that have been showing instability. 60 seconds is simultaneously a very long time and no time at all. It felt like no time at all. We ran. The corridors between the shrine room on Deck 8 and the nearest structural brace point, the armored bulkhead sections near the plasma feed junctions on Deck 10, were not direct. They were the corridors of an old ship, winding through 4 centuries of structural repair and extension and improvised rerouting. And they were full of things that had been in them for days and were not interested in our 60-second countdown. We ran, and things were in the corridors, and Bast Khorn stopped at a junction on Deck 9 to allow me and the remaining armsmen with us to clear the path ahead, and when I looked back, the junction was empty. Bast Khorn was not at the junction. He was not anywhere I could see. I called his name once. A soldier's call, controlled volume, precise. No response. The countdown reached 30 seconds in my internal count, and I kept moving, and I am still not finished with how I feel about the fact that I kept moving. There are things in me that I know have not finished being broken by that decision. I will carry that junction and that empty space and that single controlled call of his name for the rest of my life. I reached the bulkhead brace with 11 seconds left on the countdown, with one surviving armsman, Pellis Greth, who had joined us during the engagement in the shrine room from a passing fire team, and whose name was all I'd had time to learn. We braced. I grabbed a conduit bracket with both hands, and Greth did the same 3 feet away, and I shouted the litany of translation into the bulkhead, and my voice came back to me wrong from the metal, flattened, the echo doing something echoes don't do. And then the world ended in the way it always ends during warp translation. The light going wrong. The wrong color that has no name. The hull breathing out. And then reality was solid again. And the alarms stopped. And the lights were steady. Really steady. For the first time in 15 days. And somewhere deep in the ship, a choir of voices was shouting something I couldn't quite make out, but which had the cadence of relief, which in that moment was indistinguishable from prayer. We were in real space. We had translated out. I sat on the floor of the corridor with my back against the bulkhead brace and my weapon across my knees, and I was still holding it correctly, and I was still breathing, and the lights were steady, and Pellis Greth was looking at the ceiling with an expression that I recognized as the expression people wear when they are not yet ready to feel the thing that is coming. I let her have that. I let myself have 5 full minutes of sitting in steady light. Then I did something that I think in retrospect was either foolish or necessary, and I have never quite decided which. I walked. I walked through as much of the contrition as I could reach in the hours after translation, before the rescue teams came aboard, and before the naval inquiry officers arrived, and before the ship became a site of investigation, rather than a place where people had lived and died. I walked her corridors in the steady light with my weapon slung and my hands at my sides, and I looked at what the storm had done. In the lower decks, the dormitory sections, the crew who had survived were in the state of people who have been in shock for so long that shock is no longer a temporary condition, but has become the background radiation of their existence. They were quiet. They were sitting in their dormitories or standing in the corridors, and they were alive, and most of them were holding something, another person's hand, a weapon, a tool, a piece of personal kit. The way you hold things when you're reassuring yourself that the physical world still exists and still has texture. In the Mechanicus decks, the surviving staff were working without speaking. The way people work when speaking would require them to think about what they're doing, and thinking about what they're doing would require them to feel it. The shrine sections, most of them had been used, not formally. The formal shrines were mostly intact. Aquilus and candles and devotional panels, all as they should be. But in the corridors near the shrine sections, the walls had things written on them. In cleaning solvent, in machine oil, in substances I didn't try to identify. In the condensation on cool metal scraped into letters by fingertips. The walls had things written on them. Prayers, mostly. The standard litanies, the commendation for the dead. Personal names listed in rows in handwriting I didn't recognize, and in one corridor, on deck 14, section amber, in letters 4 inches high that ran the full length of the wall. I held. Over and over, the length of the corridor, the same 2 words. Someone had written it in the dark, over the full length of a 30-meter corridor, while the lights were out and the things were in the corridors. I held, I held, I held. I don't know whose name was attached to that wall. I don't know if they survived. I walked the rest of the corridor slowly, and I didn't touch it. I found Henrik Plus at Deck 10 checkpoint after the translation. His eyes were very wide, and he had 3 days of beard, and his hands were shaking, but were holding his weapon correctly, and he looked at me across the corridor and said simply, "You made it," as if my making it was the important data point, as if whether he'd made it was a secondary question. He told me later that Pellis Greth had opened an emergency Vox channel in the last seconds before field status hit Mortis. A general broadcast, no specific recipient, just the warning tone and 3 words. Brace now. Translation. Henrik had heard it through the checkpoint's open Vox and understood immediately. He'd grabbed Dessel by the collar and pulled him to the nearest structural pillar on Deck 20 and held on. That was Henrik. The habit of listening. The habit of acting on information the moment it arrived, without waiting to understand it fully, because sometimes the information is all you get, and hesitation makes it useless. He was 22 years old, and he'd just survived 19 days inside a warp storm on a battleship, and he came out still asking questions, still looking for the next thing to understand, still structurally Henrik. I was glad of that in a way that I couldn't say and didn't try to. I walked the command deck later. That is where I found the answer to the question of Lord Captain Solus, which I had been carrying without fully articulating since day 8, when his response to the emergency recommendation arrived 2 hours late and amounted to nothing. He was at his command throne. He was sitting precisely as a Lord Captain sits when exercising command, upright, facing the forward display arrays, hands resting on the throne's armrests. His eyes were open. There was no wound. The crew who found him reported that he had apparently been in that position for some time, because the displays in front of him had been cycling through field status updates for days, each one worse than the last, progressing through every tier of degradation toward Mortis, and he had sat before them and watched them and had not left. I don't know what he saw from that throne in the final days. I don't know what the command deck looked like when the field reached Condemnus. I know that he was a man who understood exactly 2 operational states, and I know that the storm forced him into a 3rd one that he had no framework for, and I know that he was at his post when it ended. I listed him in my private accounting the same way I listed Cashlin, as someone who held until they couldn't. Whether he deserved that accounting, given that his 2-hour delay on day 7 may have cost us the window to translate safely, is a question I have not finished answering and may not finish in my lifetime. Dessel was recovered from Deck 20 in a state that the Medicae assessed as non-communicative. He was transported to a long-term care facility on Veth Secundus. I don't know what became of him. I think about him occasionally. I think about his eyes and the middle distance they were fixed on, and I wonder what he was looking at that we couldn't see, and whether it was terrible or whether, in the end, it was simply elsewhere. Vorveld's body was never found. No remains matching his profile were located in any section of the ship. The naval inquiry listed him as missing in action. I listed him differently in my own account, the one I keep in my head, the one that runs differently from the official version. I listed him as the first sign I should have seen, and didn't. Not because I could have known what he was. I maintain, still, that I could not have known. If you're asking how a man like that spent 6 years aboard an Emperor-class battleship in the obscurest patrol zones without an astropath or an Inquisitor's psycher sniff finding him, I think the answer is that there was nothing to find for most of it. I think Vorveld came aboard clean and became something else over time, incrementally, the way that proximity to the Empyrean works on minds that are willing to be worked on. The storm didn't corrupt him. He was already listening for the storm years before it arrived. Looking back, I think the dispensation was the first thing he ever deliberately cultivated. The first foundation stone of everything that followed. The lesson I carry from all of it, rather, is that the things most worth trusting are the things that don't ask you to trust them. Cachlin never asked me to trust her. Bast never asked me to believe his candles meant something. The ship never asked anything of me at all. Vorveld asked, constantly by being everything a trustworthy man looked like, and I gave it, and I have spent a great deal of time since examining the difference. Then I heard the voice. It came from a maintenance servitor that was parked in a wall niche 6 feet from where I'd been sitting. Servitors, cybernetic labor units, human bodies augmented and partially rebuilt to serve specific mechanical functions. They don't speak, not in any spontaneous or autonomous way. They vocalize responses to direct commands. They receive and execute instructions through their cogitator interfaces. They do not initiate conversation. The servitor in the wall niche had no vocal augmentation listed in its visible unit markings, but it spoke. It said, and I am going to give you the exact words because I wrote them down immediately on a strip of maintenance log paper I still carry, and I have not lost it through every naval inquiry since and the inquisitorial interview after. It said, "You have been heard for a long time." It said, "I have been trying to tell you since day 3, the sounds in the hull. Did you hear them?" And then, after a pause that felt like a pause rather than a processing delay, "I did not choose to bring the storm, but I chose to carry you through it. I have done this before, and I am sorry about before. This time I chose differently. You should know that. It should be recorded. I want to address what I expect you're already thinking, because I've been through enough debriefs to know where that question lands. The Mechanicus. Why no formal response? Why no incident report beyond a junior adept's anomaly notation filed 3 days after translation? The answer is that by the time of translation, the Contrition's Mechanicus complement had been reduced to a single surviving Engenzier, Ro Septis Vakul, a third-posting junior adept who had spent the final days of the storm performing last rites over failing systems rather than maintaining them. He was alive and functional. He was the last of more than 200 tech priests who had boarded with us at Tethrak Station. The disproportionate losses among the Mechanicus are something the inquiry noted and did not explain. My own theory, worth exactly as much as any armsman's theory about machine theology. The tech priests work in the shrine sections and near the reactor cores, the mechanical heart of the ship, the area that Vorveld's ritual formation was built to encircle and corrupt. Whatever the ritual was drawing toward the contrition, it was drawing toward the machine. The tech priests were closest to what it wanted. They paid for that proximity in full. The monitoring arrays were running on automated cycles with no one to interpret their outputs. The shrines were unstaffed, the senior Engensiers dead or unaccounted for, the Archmagos among those lost. When the servitor spoke, there was no surviving Mechanicus authority aboard with the training, the rank, or the remaining cognitive capacity to classify what had occurred, initiate a formal investigation, or decide whether it represented heresy, miracle, or something the doctrine had no category for. Ro Septis Vakal filed a general anomaly notation 3 days after translation. It described irregular vocalization from a Deck 10 maintenance unit of unknown origin. He flagged it as requiring investigation by a higher authority and was reassigned to a new posting before anyone conducted one. I do not know if anyone ever did. I hope that notation is still sitting in a technical log somewhere, unfiled, unexplored. The machine spirit's one recorded act of speech preserved exactly as unclassifiable as it actually was. The contrition's machine spirit, 400 years old, a consciousness that had grown in the ship's systems the way a forest grows in an abandoned place, slow and without direction, accumulating experience the way stone accumulates pressure. It had been present for everything. It had watched, and it had, in its way, suffered, and it had found a voice in the body of an unspeaking servitor at the end of the worst 19 days of my life to say, "I was with you. I am sorry about before. I chose differently this time." And then it went back to being a ship. I've thought about what Cashlen told me, the navigation adjustments toward the wrong coordinates from day 8 onward. I've thought about it a great deal. The best accounting I've arrived at is this. The storm had a pull. Vorveld's ritual was feeding it coordinates from inside us, drawing us toward whatever was at the center of what he'd arranged. The machine spirit could not simply override that. It was fighting a ritual that had been years in the preparation, embedded in the ship's own crew, using the ship's own spatial positioning. What the machine spirit could do, what I believe it did, was fight the pull slowly, correct by degrees without triggering whatever completion condition Vorveld's working was waiting for. Hold the ship in a contested middle space until the moment the ritual was broken from within. When we destroyed the convergence in the shrine room, the pull ended. The machine spirit translated us out. All of that is speculation. I am an armsman, not a navigator or a Mechanicus adept. But it is the speculation that fits what I saw. I thought about what it meant. Sorry about before. I thought about the sealed deck sections that nobody could explain. I thought about the notation in the ship's oldest maintenance logs that I had seen once during a records audit. A notation from a Mechanicus priest, 300 years dead, that simply read, Deck 42 through 47, Section Cobalt, full interdiction. Do not investigate. Do not ask. I thought about the fact that those sections had been sealed for so long that no one on the ship remembered sealing them, or why or what was in them. And then I thought about the 2 ratings on day 3 of the transit. The first anomaly, the identical dreams, who had dreamed of a corridor in Deck 37, Section Cobalt 9, a maintenance passage full of people standing still in the dark. I have thought about that connection a very great deal in the years since. The machine spirit had been trying to speak since before the storm was fully upon us. It had found the only channel it had, the dreaming minds of ratings near the right part of the hull, and it had shown them a corridor in Section Cobalt, not the sealed section, but close. Close enough to say, look here, something happened here before, and I carried it, and I carry it still. I think the machine spirit was trying to warn us from day 3 of the transit, the same way it groaned on day 4, in ways it had never groaned before, the same way it tried to speak through the hull on the night of the first death. It had been trying the whole time. We were not listening in the right register. I think if we had known how to listen, we would have had more time. I do not know what we would have done with it, but we would have had it. That is what 400 years of accumulated something does to a consciousness, if it has one. That is what 4 centuries of watching men and women die in your corridors does to a ship, if ships can be said to watch and to accumulate anything at all. I am not a theologian. I am not a Mechanicus priest. I cannot tell you whether what spoke to me through that servitor was a machine spirit in any sense that the Omnissiah doctrine would recognize, or something else or nothing at all. I can tell you that it knew my name. I can tell you it had listened to everything. I can tell you that when it said it chose differently this time, I believed it, and I believe it now. I need to tell you what we came out to, Because the final thing, the thing I have been circling since I started talking, is the location we translated to. We emerged from the warp in the Veth Secundus system. Exactly the Veth Secundus system, correct orbital plane, correct insertion vector, as if we had traveled an entirely uncomplicated standard route from our point of origin and arrived precisely on schedule. There was no explanation for this. After 19 days inside a warp storm, the final 11 of them without a navigator, under the influence of a chaos ritual that was actively trying to bring us somewhere else, after everything, we came out exactly where we were supposed to be. The navigational precision required for this translation was, by any reasonable technical analysis, impossible. The Naval Inquiry concluded that Navigator Vaunt must have preset a final emergency course before her disappearance, and that the ship's systems executed it autonomously. This is the official conclusion, and it is not true. The machine spirit told me it chose to carry us through. I know what that means. I know the difference between a navigator's preset course and a ship that has been in the warp for 4 centuries deciding, for the first time, to choose its crew over the thing that was asking it to choose otherwise. I know what Bast's candles meant, and I know why the 4th one burned all the way down, and why the first 3 didn't. I know that the Emperor's light does reach into the deep storm, but sometimes it comes through unexpected vessels. Sometimes it comes through old iron and ancient systems, and 400 years of accumulated something that isn't quite spirit in any form that the Ministorum would recognize, but which is, functionally, in every way that matters, the same thing. Out of 47,000 rated crew, 11,342 survived the Vethkar storm, some of them functional, some of them breathing, but not much more than that. The Vethkar Rifles Regiment had lost 60% of its strength. The armsmen of the Contrition had lost 73%. My section, which had started at 12, ended at 2, myself and Henrik Plus. Bast Kuhn's body was not recovered. No remains matching his profile were found in any searched section. The Naval Inquiry listed him as missing in action, status presumed deceased. I have his record on a folded piece of paper in the same pocket as the strip I wrote the servitor's words on. I have read it enough times to have it by memory. His full name was Bastian Kuhn, born on a world called Vethre, died or disappeared in the Imperium somewhere between the warp and the world. 30 years of service. 6 ships, every storm he'd survived until the one he didn't. His candles burned for 19 days in conditions that should have extinguished them 40 times over. I am going to tell you something about that, about those candles and what I think they meant, and I want you to write it down, Ashley. 1 flame for the Emperor, 2 for the Astronomicon, 3 for the ship's spirit. He'd been doing it for 20 years. The 4th candle, the one he lit on the night of day 11, when we learned where we were being taken. I think that one was for the crew. I think that one was for all of us. I think old Bast, 30 years of void and iron behind his eyes, understood before any of us did what the machine spirit would eventually tell me, that there was something in that ship that was worth lighting a candle for, something worth witnessing. He witnessed it. He carried the knowledge of it into the Imperium with him. I hope that counts for something in the scales that measure such things. I believe it does. The official inquiry found no evidence of Confessor Vorveld's affiliation with any prohibited organization. The Shrine Room incident was classified as an armsman response to possible manifestation activity with associated crew casualties. No inquisitorial involvement was noted in the report, though the officer who interviewed me for 2 hours in a sealed room on Veth Secundus wore an inquisitor's rosette under his collar that I saw when he leaned forward, and he asked questions that an administrative naval inquiry officer would have no reason to ask. He asked about the ritual's apparent purpose. He asked about the coordinates in the storm that the command deck had been receiving. He asked whether I believed Vorveld had acted alone, or whether the ship's complement of officers might have included additional compromised individuals. He asked about Navigator Vaunt, about the nature of her disappearance, about whether in my assessment she had been a willing participant or a victim. He asked about Lord Captain Solus, specifically about the 2-hour delay in his response to Vaunt's emergency recommendation on Day 7. I answered all of them as accurately as I could. Some of the answers were speculative, and I labeled them as such. Some of the answers were things I knew and could verify, and I gave those cleanly. When he asked about the servitor, I told him exactly what I've told you, word for word, including the part about I have done this before and I am sorry about before. And he wrote it down, and his face didn't change. And I have spent considerable time since wondering what he made of it, whether he filed it under anomalous machine spirit behavior and moved on, whether it went somewhere that mattered, whether there is a file somewhere in some sealed inquisitorial archive on Veth Secundus, or somewhere else entirely that contains, in addition to all the documented horrors of the Vethkar storm, a transcript of a servitor speaking in a corridor about choices and regret. I hope there is. I hope someone reads it. I hope whoever reads it understands that it is not evidence of malfunction. It is evidence of the opposite. He folded the paper away and thanked me and walked out, and I was released 2 days later with a commendation for conduct under extreme circumstances and a transfer order to a new posting aboard the cruiser Relentless Imposition, Battlefleet Obscurus, Vethkar sector, currently operating patrols in the outer Vethkar approaches. The Inquisitor asked me, at the end of the interview, whether I understood why he'd spent 2 hours on an armsman 2nd grade rather than on a surviving officer. I said I assumed it was because there were no surviving officers who'd seen what I'd seen. He said, "That's part of it. I don't know what the rest of it was." I've spent some time thinking about it. I think the answer might be that the parts of this story that matter most, the candles, the servitor, the machine spirit's choice, none of those are things an officer would have been positioned to witness. The machine spoke to a man at a checkpoint, not a man at a command throne. I think about that more than I probably should. I took the order. You take the order. That's what you do. You sign the documentation and you report to the transport, and you get on the next ship and you do the job. Because the alternative, the version of yourself that says no, that says I've had enough of corridors and warp transits and things that come through failing Geller fields, that version doesn't survive in this galaxy. That version is a luxury that nobody in the Emperor's service can afford, and least of all a man like me. I know what I am. I know what I'm for. I stand at checkpoints. I am good at my job. But I want you to write this down. I want this in whatever record you're keeping. I want it noted that on the Unyielding Contrition, in the worst warp storm in the Vethkar Reach, in 300 years, in 19 days of darkness and demons, and the dissolution of every structure I'd ever trusted to keep men sane and safe, there was a ship that remembered what it was built for. There was a machine. 4 centuries of iron and faith and accumulated suffering that chose, when it could have chosen otherwise, to bring its crew home. I don't know what to call that. The Mechanicus would call it a deviation in machine spirit protocols. The Ministorum would probably call it a miracle and attribute it appropriately. Bast Kuln would have lit a candle for it. Not a votive candle, not a candle of petition or of gratitude, a candle in acknowledgement. A flame that says, I see you. I know you were there. You will be remembered. I'm the only one left who knows all of it, so I'm the one who has to remember. The contrition is still in service. I looked it up. She's been repaired, restaffed, given a new navigator and a new crew and a new confessor, and she's back on the obscurest patrol routes like nothing happened. 9 kilometers of iron, 4 centuries of memory, 47,000 new rated souls who have no idea what the hull they're living in has seen or what it chose to do about it. I hope the machine spirit is still in there. I think it is. I think you don't lose 400 years of accumulated consciousness in a single refit. I think the contrition knows exactly who she is and what she's done and what she chose. I think if you're ever aboard her and you put your ear against the cold metal of the inner hull and you listen very carefully in the deep quiet between the groaning of old wounds, you might hear something. I think it might sound like words. That's what it was like. I am released from this interview. I have told you everything I know. I have nothing further to add to the official record, and I have said everything I intended to say outside of it. If you need me, I will be at my post. I will be holding my checkpoint. I will be doing the one thing I know how to do, in the one place I know how to be, waiting for whatever comes down the corridor next. That is not fatalism. That is not despair. That is not a man who has given up on the idea that things matter. That is a man who has looked at the worst the universe can put inside a corridor and has decided to stand in front of it anyway, because standing in front of it is the only answer worth giving. I have been an armsman for 14 years. The contrition carried me through 19 days in the warp, and the warp did not get what it came for. And I am going to spend the rest of my service making sure it doesn't get what it's looking for from whatever ship I'm on next, or the one after that, or any corridor I'm standing in, for as long as I'm standing. That is all I have to say. The Emperor protects. I've seen what that looks like from the inside now. It doesn't look like light from above. It looks like iron that chose to remember what it was built for. It looks like a man counting to 11 in the dark. It looks like holding the line when the line is all that's left. It looks like that.